We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Vav Amid Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 46b. And the previous Amud Rabbi Yochanan said, why does it say 3 times kares by shlamim? That's talking about eating from the carbon shlamim b'tomas haguf when the person is tamei. And Rabbi Yochanan continues and explains achas lechlal v'achas leprat. One is for a generalization, one is for a specification, v'achas ledvarim she'eino nechol, and one is for things which are not eaten. Rashi explains achas lechlal v'achas leprat lidrosh davar shaya bechlal v'yotza min haklal lelamed lo lelamed al atzmo yotza ela lelamed ala klal kulo yotza. It's to make a drush in the following fashion. Sometimes you have something that's part of a general rule, but then you specify something to teach something about that general rule, as Rashi now explains. It says that a person, again, who's tamei, who eats from the meat of the carbon shlamim. Now, shlamim really is just included in all kachim. This halach of not eating kachim b'tumas haguf, that includes all kachim, not just shlamim. So why is it that shlamim is specified? Lahakish aleim, it's to compare to them, velomar lach, and to tell you, ma shlamim miyuchadim kachim mizbeach, just like shlamim are kachim mizbeach. That's talking about kachim, that's talking about karbonos that are brought on the mizbeach. Av kol kachim mizbeach. So too this halach of kares by tumas haguf is talking specifically by kachim mizbeach. And then finally the other one is ledvarim she'ena necholin. It says one time kares to say that it applies even to things that are not eaten. Kagon, for example, eitzim, for example, the wood, ulavon, and the frankincense. She'enon ru'uyim lachila, they are on the mizbeach, but they're not things that are normally eaten. Im achal mehem b'tumas haguf, if one eats from them b'tumas haguf, chayiv, then the person is liable, kirabbanan demas nisan. And this statement of Rabbi Yochanan is following the opinion of the Rabbanan in our Mishnah that say that one is chayiv for that. Again, Rabbi Shimon disagrees, as the Gemara now goes on and says, Ul Rabbi Shimon d'amar dvarim she'ein necholin, ein chayovin aleim misham tuma. According to Rabbi Shimon, who says that if something is not normally eaten, there's no liability if one eats it b'tumas haguf. So leisuye mai. So what is that kares coming to include? And the Gemara says to that, leisuye chatos hapnimios, that's to include the inner carbon chatases. They're also included in this halacha of eating b'tumas haguf. Why would one think they're not included? Sal gadai tachamina, one might have thought, hoel v'yamar Rabbi Shimon, since Rabbi Shimon says, kol she'eno al mizbeach hachitzon keshlamim, anything that doesn't go on the outer mizbeach like shlamim, ein chayav and olam mishum pigul, there's no liability of pigul, so mishum tumma nami lo l'chayiv. One might think also for tumma, there's no liability. One might think that within Rabbi Shimon. So kamash malon, that's what the pasuk here is teaching us, that again, this halach of tumas haguf, eating it, but tumas haguf applies to the chatos, hapnimios as well. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Numi Rabbi Shimon mechayev es shadarko lecho. Rabbi Shimon says there's a liability. This is talking about by tumas haguf, when the person eats the kachim but tumas haguf. So we said in the Mishnah there's a liability to kares, but Rabbi Shimon says that's only when it's something that's normally eaten. But let's say the wood on the mizbeach, which is not normally eaten, there's no liability when eating that but tumas haguf. The Chachamim disagree. They say there is a liability even when eating that but tumas haguf. And the Gemara says, Itmar, it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoraim, Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argue about this. And also Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina also have the same Machlokas. Chad mehai zuzah v'chad mehai zuzah. It's one from each pair, essentially arguing with the other from each pair. And the Machlokas Amoraim is as follows. Chad Omar Machlokas b'Tumas Basar. One says that the Machlokas in the Mishnah is by Tumas Basar. Let's say the meat, the item is Tameh. Aval b'Tumas Haguf, but if the person is Tameh, Divrei HaKol Eino Loka, then everybody agrees there is no Malchus, there's no liability. Let's say the person is Tameh and eats, let's say, the wood of the Mizbeach. The Chadam, and the other one says, no, Kemachlokas Bazu, just like there's a Machlokas by Tumas Basar, meaning when the item is Tameh, Kach Machlokas Bazu, so too there is the same Machlokas when the person is Tameh. My time, what's the reason? Kaven de Karina Beva Basar Asher Yiga B'chol Tameh, since we refer to the pasuk that the meat is Tameh, in other words, we apply it, let's say over there, to the wood being Tameh. So Karin and Bay, we also apply in a situation of the wood, or in a situation of something that's not normally eaten, v'tumaso olav. Again, when the person is tameh, we apply the same rules across the board, and therefore there is a machlokas over there as well. And Rashi explains, Chad mehai zuzah, again, one from this pair and one from that pair, Amri chadamilsa, they say one side of the machlokas, v'inach trei, and the other two amoraim, chadamilsa, they say the other side of the machlokas. Chad Amar, one says, Chad mehai zuzah, Amar machlokas shenechliku chachama Rabbi Shimon shechayiv, Again, the whole machlokas and the fact that the Chachamim are arguing Rabbi Shimon and they say chayiv even by things that are not normally eaten, that's betumas basar. That's if the meat is tamei, the item is tamei. Meaning, im achlan la'etzim ulavona tamei, and let's say the person eats the wood that's tamei or the frankincense that's tamei. So loka, so then there would be malchus. Misham lav dev'habasar shiga b'chol tamei. That's included in the lav of the meat that is tamei. There it's a lav. There's malchus. D'yamar mar v'habasar yiseira l'rabos etzim ulavona. The master said the extra word, the extra phrase in v'habasar includes eitzim and lavona. Avol betumas haguf, but let's say the person is tamei and he eats the wood or the lavona. V'hein tahorim, the wood and the lavona are tar. Divrei hakol eino loka. Then everybody agrees there is no malchus. To lois rabu ba, that is not included. Everybody would agree that is not included in the tumas haguf prohibition. And Rashi continues, Hachi Garcinon Kaven de Karinon Beva Abosar Asher Yiga. The other opinion is no, the machlokas applies even by Tumas Haguf, because if we're applying it to Vahabosar Asher Yiga, if we're applying the lav when the meat is tamei to, let's say, when the wood or the frankincense is tamei, so Karina Beva Tumasu Olav Inichursa, so also the Tumasu Olav Inichursa will apply. When the person is tamei and he eats those items, there's going to be kares. Kilomar Kaven de Betumas Bosar Amri Rabbanan Loke. Since by Tumas Bosar the Rabbanan say Malchus, Eitzim Ulavona. But Tumas Haguf Nami Islahu Deloka. When it comes to the wood and the Lavona by Tumas Haguf, also there's Malchus. The Hagave Hadad Iksivi, because they're written together. It's interesting over here because the pasuk is talking about Tumas Haguf, which is Vinichursa, which is Kares, and Rashi, like the Gemara, is mentioning Malchus, and Tosas addressed that as well. Tosas say, Aval Betumas Haguf Divrei Hakol Eino Loka. By Tumas Haguf, everybody agrees there is no Malchus, according to one opinion. V'im Tomar V'ho Amrinan La'el. You're going to ask as follows. We said earlier, Shalosh Krisos B'Shlomim. Again, there are 3 times it says Kares by Shlomim by Tumas Haguf. Chad L'Dvarim She'ena Necholin. And then one of the things that was included was the things that are not normally eaten. So L'chol HaPachos Tivshot, so at the very least we should be able to answer. To Rabbi Yochanan, D'Amar K'machlokas Bazu, Kach Machlokas Bazu. That was Rabbi Yochanan who made that statement. He said again the Shalosh Krisos, so the statement about the Shalosh Krisos. So isn't it clear at least that Rabbi Yochanan holds there is a Machlokas by Tumas Haguf just like by Tumas Basar? Because Rabbi Yochanan is the one that made that statement, and he said we're including the Kares by Dvarim She'ena Necholin, meaning according to the Chachamim would argue by Tumas Haguf. V'yorin further, Tanya v'me'ilu, we learned in a Brisa, Gabe Levona v'chayavim aleh, mishum pigol v'noser v'tamei. It says by Levona that there's a liability of pigol, noser, and tamei. And so again, it seems to be that there is this machlokas. And Tosas continue and answer, V'yesh Lomar, we can answer, the Dafka Malchus Kamar, maybe the Gemara over here is only talking about Malchus, De'eno Loka, that there would not be Malchus again in a situation by Tumas Haguf, where the item is not something that's normally eaten. That's what we're saying over here. To Lois Rabu Elalinian Kares, maybe the inclusion is only by Kares and not by Malchus, and maybe this Gemara is just talking about Malchus. But then Tosas say, Umiyu, nevertheless, Lo Mashmachi, this does not seem to be correct. Midaka'amar Kaven de Karinon Bey V'Abosar Asher Yiga, Karinon Bey V'Tumaso Olav, because the Gemara is saying since we apply the pasuk of V'Habosar Asher Yiga, we would apply the pasuk of V'Tumaso Olav as well. And V'Tumaso Olav, again, as Rashi quoted the pasuk, is talking about Kares, Mashma Da'irinami Linyan Kares. That implies that we are talking also about Kares, and so that Tosas is leaving as a question whether the Gemara here is addressing only Malchus or Kares as well. And the Gemara continues, Rav Tavyume Masni Hachi, Rav Tavyume, he taught the above Gemara the way we learned it above, meaning the Machlokas Amoraim was within the Chachamim. The Chachamim who say that there's a liability when it comes to things that are not normally eaten. So there's a Machlokas Amoraim, is that by Tumas Basar, is that by Tumas Haguf as well? But Rav Kahana Masni Hachi, Rav Kahana, he taught it as follows, Chad me Haizuza v'chad me Haizuza Aseifa, that one from this pair of Amoraim and one from that pair of Amoraim, there's a Machlokas on the end of the Mishnah, meaning a Machlokas within Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon is the one that says that there is no liability when it comes to something that is not normally eaten. So there we have a Machlokas Amoraim in terms of what Rabbi Shimon meant. Chad Amar Machlokas b'Tumas Haguf. One says the Machlokas is by Tumas Haguf. There Rabbi Shimon says that there is no liability if it's not normally eaten. Aval b'Tumas Basar divrei hakol loka. But by Tumas Basar, when we're talking about the item being tamei, let's say the wood or the lavona, everybody agrees there would be Malchus. There even Rabbi Shimon would agree that there would be Malchus. V'chad Amar, and the other one says no, k'machlokas bazu kach machlokas bazu. Just like there's a Machlokas by Tumas Haguf, so too there's a Machlokas by Tumas Basar, meaning Rabbi Shimon would say that that there's an exemption even by Tumas Basar when it comes to things that are not normally eaten. Amar Rava says, it makes sense to say that the machlokus is in both cases, again, not only by Tumas Aguf, but by Tumas Basar as well. My time, what is the reason? Because if we're not applying the pasuk of a Tumaso Olav v'nichrasa by something that's not normally eaten, so lo karinan beiva basar asher yiga b'chol tamei lo yachal. We're also not going to apply the pasuk of v'habasar asher yiga b'chol tamei when the item is becoming tamei, and so therefore again Rabbi Shimon will argue in both situations. The Gemara continues and asks v'amar mar, but didn't the master say v'habasar l'rabos eitzim u'levona, that the word v'habasar, it includes eitzim and levona, so clearly they are included when the item becomes tamei. They should be included in that liability. And the Gemara says to that, Lipsula bi'alma, that's just a disqualification. Rashi understands the Gemara means to say that's just disqualified on a Darabonon level, but it's not D'oraisa. Rashi explains, Lipsula bi'alma, Maila Darabonon, it's just a Darabonon, Ukra asmachta bi'alma, the Pasuk is just an asmachta. V'hachi aminim b'psachim, that's what we say in Psachim, de'in lokan olav, that there would not be malchus for that. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, L'shem shisha devarim hazevach nizbach, the slaughtered animal, that's the carbon is slaughtered for the sake of the following 6 things. L'shem zevach, it's slaughtered for the sake of the carbon. L'shem zoveach, it's slaughtered for the sake of the zoveach, the one offering the carbon, meaning the owner. L'shem Hashem, it's slaughtered for Hashem. L'shem ishim, it's slaughtered for the fire, that's the fire of the mizbeach. L'shem reach, it's slaughtered for the aroma. L'shem nichoach, it's slaughtered to be pleasing to God. V'hachatos v'asham l'shem chet, and the carbon chatos and carbon asham, they're slaughtered for the sake of the sin that they're being brought as an atonement for. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Afmi shalohaya belibo l'shem echon mikol elu, even if somebody doesn't have in mind for any of these things, kosher, it is kosher, shu t'nai bezin, it's actually a stipulation of the court, she'ein ha'machshava holeches ela achar ha'oved, because the intent follows the one who's performing the service, means to say, we don't want the person doing the shechita to have any intention, because if he has the wrong intention, he can disqualify, it follows his intention, he can end up disqualifying the carbon even though he's not the owner of the carbon. And Rashi explains, l'shem zevach lafuke shinoi kodesh, it means to say, it has to be for this carbon, meaning not for a different carbon. Kagon l'shem zevach acher, it shouldn't be for the sake of a different carbon. L'shem zoveach, and for the zoveach means lafuke shinoi bailim, it shouldn't be for a different owner. Vayalfina lum nikrai beparakama, this is all learned out from Sukkim in the first parak. L'shem ishim l'shem reach, for the fire and for the aroma. Begemar mefarish lafuke mai, the Gemara will explain what is this coming to exclude. V'yalif lam mikra, this will be learned from Sukkim. L'shem chet, for the sake of the sin, l'shem cheto shu mevio olav, for the sake of the sin that he's bringing the carbon for. And then Rabbi Yossi says, Af mi shalohaya belibo shashachat stam kosher, even if somebody slaughters with no intention, it's kosher. Shehu tanai bezdin sheyishchot stam, it's actually a stipulation of the court that he should slaughter without any intention. Kedamr parakama, we say this in the first parak, hisnu bezdin. Bezdin makes a stipulation, delo lema lishmo, he shouldn't say it's lishmo. Dil masi lememar shalo lishmo, maybe he'll end up saying that it's not lishmo. She'ena machshava holechas ala achar ha'oved, because the machshava follows the one who's performing the sacrificial rite. Therefore, you have a shalol lishmo. If he's going to say shalol lishmo, if he's going to say not for the sake of the proper carbon, afagav de bailam amri lishmo, even though the owners are saying lishmo, they're saying it for the sake of the proper carbon. Lav midiu, it still will not be anything. It won't be good. To lav bididhu talia milsa, because it's not dependent on the owners. T'chsiv hamakriv oso lo yechashav. It's dependent upon the one who's actually bringing the offering, doing the sacrificial rite, and that's why the Bezin stipulated that he should not have any machshava. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Ola, it says in the pasuk, Ola l'shem Ola, it means to say that it should be for the sake of a carbon Ola. La'afuke l'shem shlamim delo, that excludes, if you're going to slaughter an Ola for the sake of a carbon shlamim, that would not be good. Ishim, and it says that it should be slaughtered to be consumed by the fire on the mizbeach. L'shem ishim, for the sake of being consumed by the fire. La'afuke kevava delo, that excludes, let's say, just being grilled on the fire, that would not be good. Reach, it says, as an aroma, l'shem reach, it has to be for the sake of the aroma. La'afuke evarim shetzelon vehelon delo, that would exclude, let's say you had limbs that you roasted them first and then offered them on the mizbeach, that would not be good. To Yamar Rav Yehuda Rav, because Rav Yehuda said that Rav said evarim shetzelon vehelon, if you have limbs that were roasted and then brought onto the mizbeach, ein bohen mishum reach, that's not going to be an aroma because they've already been roasted. Nichoach, then it says it should be pleasing to Hashem. L'shem hanochas ruach means to say again it should be accepted, pleasing to Hashem. LaHashem, it says in the pasuk LaHashem, l'shem misha amar v'haya olam, it's for the sake of the one who spoke and brought the world into existence. And Rashi explains Ola l'shem Ola. Again, it says in the pasuk Ola, it means for the sake of an Ola. Kra kadorish Ola ishei reach nichoach l'Hashem. We're darshaning the pasuk. The pasuk says Ola ishei reach nichoach l'Hashem, and we're darshaning. V'av agav delav b'shchita ksiv. Now, even though this is not written by the slaughtering, here we're talking about by the slaughtering. Eshkachan le b'shlamim gabe zvicha. We do find this similar by shlamim by slaughtering. V'hikrib mi zevach hashlamim ishei l'Hashem shetei zvicha l'shem shlamim. There it means that the slaughtering should be for the sake of shlamim l'shem ishim, for the sake of the fire l'shem shem, for the sake of Hashem. V'haidanak hacha kra de Ola. Now, the only reason over here we're choosing the pasuk by Ola, not shlamim, mishum dechsivi kulu gabe, because all of these things are written by Ola. V'gabe shlamim lo ksib bahu kra l'reach nichoach. By the shlamim, it's not written in the pasuk l'reach nichoach. La'afuke kevava, and then the Gemara said it's to exclude when it's grilled. Al manas la'asoso chatichos tzaluyos begecholim. What that means is, let's say you had in mind that you're going to have cuts of the meat that would be roasted by coals. And Rashi continues, Ein bohem mishum reach. It's not reach. If it's roasted first, it's not an aroma. If it was roasted first outside of the fires of the Mizbeach, sulo maski reich, it's not going to bring up an aroma. Hanochas ruach, it should be pleasing. Nachas ruach lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Sha'amar v'nasa ritzono, it's pleasing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that his will was fulfilled. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, Chatos sheshechoto l'shem ola psula. If you have a carbon chatos that's slaughtered as a carbon ola, that is disqualified, but l'shem chulin. But if it's slaughtered as chulin, if it's slaughtered as a non-carbon, then kasheira, then it is kosher. Amar Rabbi Elazar says, my time with the Rav, what's the reason of Rav? V'lo yechalalu es kodshe b'nei Yisrael. It says you can't profane the kodshim of b'nei Yisrael. Kodshim mechalin kodshim. So if you have in mind for a different carbon, that can make it profaned, that can make it disqualified. Vein chulin mechalin kodshim. But if you have in mind for chulin, that is not going to disqualify. Rashi explains, "V'lo yechalu ein davar acher mechal es kodshim elami mechalu kodshim mechalin kodshim." Only kodshim is mechal kodshim. Kenanafkol under v'machshava shalo l'shmo mischalim miveshachar osol lechatos. We learned that out from the pasuk. It says slaughtered as a chatos. That's how we learn out that if you have intention shalo l'shmo, that it is going to be disqualified. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Meisiv Rabba asks on this idea that again l'shem chulin is not a problem. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, "Af mi shelo haya belivo l'shem echad mikol elu kosher." Even if you don't have in mind anything, it's kosher. Shu tanai bezin. It's actually a stipulation of the court not to have in mind for anything. And so the Gemara says, "Taima shelo haya belivo klal." The reason why it's okay is because he had nothing in mind. Haya belivo l'shem chulin. Puzzle, doesn't it imply that if he had in mind for chulin, that actually would be a disqualification? Rashi explains, "Time of the lohaya belibo klal sheshachto stam." If he slaughtered it stam with no intention, umemela karv lishmo. So then we say automatically that's considered lishmo. But again, doesn't that imply that l'shem chulin is disqualified? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar le Abaya said to him, Dilma lohaya klal kosher umeratza. Maybe if he has nothing in mind, it's kosher and it's accepted. Hahaya belibo l'shem chulin. But maybe if he has in mind for chulin, so then kosher, it still is kosher. Ve'eno meratza, but it won't be as accepted. And Rashi explains, Halashem chulin kosher ve'eno meratza. V'chiyama Rav nami kasheira ve'eno meratza kamer. Even when Rav said kosher, he didn't mean that it's ideal. It's still kosher ve'eno meratza. It's kosher, but it's not fully accepted. It is missing something when you have in mind for chulin. Maybe that's what it means over here. Maybe that's what Rabbi Yossi means as well. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Elazar says, Chatas sheshechata l'shem chulin ksheira. If the chatas is slaughtered for the sake of chulin, it's kosher. But mishum chulin psula. But let's say it's slaughtered because the person thinks it's chulin. He doesn't realize that it's a carbon. So then actually it is disqualified. And the Gemara says, Kedebai minei Shmuel me Rav Huna, like Shmuel asked Rav Huna. And Rashi explains, l'shem chulin, and if it's for the sake of chulin, sheyodea shi chatas. He knows it's a chatas. V'shakat l'shem chulin, but he slaughters it as chulin. So kasher, then it's kosher. That's like we said, chulin doesn't desecrate kachim. But mishum chulin, if he kasaver shem chulin, if he thinks it's chulin, psula, then it's disqualified. Because then already he's thinking about other matters. He doesn't even know he's dealing with something that is kachim, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph.